Welcome back to the Rent Roll Queen podcast. I'm your host, Tarsi Taylor, and today's episode is sponsored by Reebok, the Real Estate Business Owners Conference. Do you run a business with your life partner? Today, I chat with Nicole Schippani all about how you can prepare for the worst and expect the best. Welcome to the show, Nicole.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you on. How long have you been a solicitor for?
2 years and 4 months, maybe just under.
I love how, it's like 2
Very
years, 4
specific
months.
with dates.
Yes,
so,
yes.
Yeah.
Well, you have to be, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Why should people have financial binding agreements? Oh, actually, firstly, what are financial binding agreements for anyone who's listening in? Because not everyone knows what they actually are.
Yeah, so most people probably wouldn't know what a financial agreement is, but everyone's definitely heard the term prenup, or you've probably seen the number plates driving around Brisbane. But they are basically like a private agreement entered into consent by the parties to determine your property settlement. So basically you're agreeing what the outcome of your property settlement would be in the event of a separation.
And most people don't think of a separation, do they? When you first get married, we all know about partnership agreements in business, but we're not actually considering what it looks like behind the scenes if something was to go wrong.
A lot of people, like I said, would know the term prenup. So people have this preconception that you can only enter them at the start of a relationship, but you can actually enter them, before cohabitation, before engagement, during marriage, after a de facto relationship. So it just means that both parties have to agree to enter it, but it just means that you then save yourself the time of going to the court and you will decide how you want your property to be dealt with. So, for example, if one person comes into the relationship with a bunch of assets and the other person doesn't, and you have concerns about that being thrown into the pool in the event of separation, because everything really does, you would then be able to essentially quarantine those assets.
There's a lot of de facto relationships that have entered into business. They end up separating and all of a sudden it's like the business basically suffers because of it. So how can people avoid, or what should people consider and when should they consider a financial binding agreement?
If it comes to, your business, a financial agreement can also then specify terms of how that business will still be run following separation and I guess how it would be dealt with. So say you're part of a family business, you have, say, 25% share in a business. That 25% share would be thrown into the property pool if you were to separate. And even if your partner at the time hasn't had any involvement in the business, it still forms part of the pool. So by entering an agreement, you can essentially quarantine that interest so that doesn't form part of the pool, but other assets might that you and your partner acquire together in the future. But you can then choose to quarantine business interests, real estate, anything that you have come into the relationship with, or if you guys are separating and you can agree on who keeps what, it just sets that out.
Money is a driving force between a lot of disagreements. So it's always better to have that agreement sort of set out when things are going good.
Yeah. Yes. They are difficult conversations to have.
They are.
Especially if, one party's kind of oblivious to it and doesn't expect the other partner to turn around and say, hey, how do you feel about entering into a financial agreement? But the other thing you do have to know is that they can be set aside for reasons such as duress. For example, if you're saying, oh, well, if you don't sign this, we're not going to get married, that could then look bad. So just giving your partner the time to, I guess, come around to it, understand it, and I guess most people probably don't even know what it means, and I think they just freak out when they hear let's enter a prenup or a financial agreement and don't actually understand what it could do or what it means for them.
Well, it's protecting both parties, isn't it?
Usually a financial agreement is more favourable to one party, I guess, especially if, you have assets at the start and the other party doesn't. But I guess where it gets tricky is if you're, a younger couple and eventually you have children, your agreement's going to have to then make special provisions of what happens if, you separate and there's children, because if one just keeps all the assets, it's a bit of a disadvantage to the other person.
Yeah.
Either way, both parties always have to get independent legal advice to understand the terms of the agreement, what they're actually signing, what it means for them, advantages, disadvantages, because that way, if you sign, you can say, I've had legal advice, I understand what I'm signing.
To have those conversations while things are going good, you have more agreeable terms because everyone's happy with it. And then what you do is basically park it and you know that, okay, well, we're going to still build this business, but there's no pressure on either side. That's the way that I see it.
If you enter into one before you separate, because you can still enter into one after you separate.
Right.
But if you enter into one before, it kind of gives you the clarity of what is going to happen if you separate, and you both know, you know, what's going to happen. I actually find that a lot of the times they'll have clarity of what happens when they separate. I guess it alleviates some stress. I mean, everyone knows that lawyers are not relatively cheap.
Yeah.
I mean, whilst an agreement will still cost you a fair bit to draft, because they do take time, because they are easily set aside, and so you got to take your time to drafting them. Essentially, then if you separate, rather than going through the court process, which could be, you know, 3+ years, depending on how big your matter is. A lot of the times when people separate, someone is bitter. It doesn't even become negotiation of what's happening. It just becomes that the other person wants the other one to suffer, and then you kind of get nowhere, and then they're spending thousands and thousands of dollars on legal fees to kind of still get nowhere. With the agreement, you guys can decide on what you want to happen, rather than letting a court decide on what will happen, which is, you know, good time-wise. I guess emotionally is probably better.
Very emotionally straining to go through divorce. I've been through it, and I can honestly say it was probably the worst. I mean, I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy at all. But knowing that, I've done things differently this time around, and that's been important to me to be able to do that. So that's where I was like, you know, they are really hard conversations, and, you know, your voice does shake. And like I said, no one's thinking about getting divorced. That's not even an inclination in my actual mind. It's more about protecting my children, my family, my business. So it's those sorts of things that, you know, if you're having those conversations early on in the piece, or, you know, you got to review them as well, right? Like, it's not something that you just set and forget. They get renewed or reviewed in like a couple, you know, like 10 years or whatever it is. Because your assets change, your situation changes. Like you said, you might have more children. There's so much more that goes in the mix. But those conversations are conversations that we should be having with our partners, not just kind of putting it underneath a carpet and you know, and then all of a sudden there's a big mound of stuff and it just blows up in your face. Like, no one wants to go through that.
Plus, if you go through the court process, you know, it's not just a discussion and an exchange of disclosure. It's months and months of exchanging disclosure, communicating, you know, the stress of what happens. People get very emotional, and it does save a lot of stress in the future, in the sense that you can choose how you want your property to be dealt with.
Yeah, and you were saying before too, like you said about being part of a family business, or, you know, say inheritance and all those sorts of things as well, because your family work really, really hard as well. So if you're being left with that, or you're part of a business that's a family-run business, well, that family has actually created that for you.
Yes. I guess that's the thing, you know, inheritance is a lot of people don't understand what happens with an inheritance during your relationship, and if you separate, you know, and if you know that you are going to get a relatively big inheritance, you can seek to quarantine that in a financial agreement as well. Same way as you can with any other assets. Whilst it's not there yet, you can still have a clause that would say something along the lines of, you know, any future inheritances they may receive. So you can also quarantine that. And I guess that gives people certainty and of, you know, whether they'll be protected or not if they're separated. I guess it's really common more for probably people who've also, like yourselves, you know, you've gone through a divorce and they've gone through the property settlement in the past and they don't want to do it again. You know, you have some people who do it 3-4 times and then decide they want to go into a financial agreement rather than the first time. But I think it's more that when, you know, you've established things yourself, you've either gone through a property settlement, you want to make sure that you keep what's yours. And that's probably like the best way to do it.
Yeah, I just honestly, for me, it was more, I don't want to go through the emotions.
Yeah.
Like, I want to basically separate that completely. If anything was to ever happen, and I'm literally, because my motto is prepare for the worst, expect the best. But in that case, the emotion that I went through in divorce was absolutely, like, it broke me.
Yeah. We get that a lot, that people just say, you know, I don't really care what it is anymore. Let's just settle. I can't do this emotionally anymore. And, you know, they think that it's more important to, you know, protect their mental health and just, you know, end it rather than spending another 2-3 years in court fighting about silly things.
Yeah.
So.
And you would have seen some pretty bad cases in your time, can you share any stories?
In particular to financial agreements or going through court, I guess, court, there's some clients, they end up spending, 2-3 years in court, sometimes even longer. And, other than the cost, it's also that you're constantly reminded of, your separation and things like that. And it is very mentally taxing for clients, and it is really hard to listen to sometimes, as in not in a insensitive way, but it's just difficult to see that people are going through this, and especially if one party is the bitter one and you're not acting for the bitter party, seeing how much they suffer because one party's just not wanting to settle because they're just playing games or...
Yeah, right. So, having that agreement in place, it's already set out in basically stone, isn't it? So that, well, not really, but yes.
Yes and no. I guess, for example, if you're a bit older, you've already got a business, assets, whatever, you can quarantine that, and, if you and your new partner separate, you essentially just keep with what you came in with, but then you'd have things that determine what happens to any joint property you acquire together, or, if you open any businesses together or anything that becomes a joint decision in the future, that then will be divided between you guys, and, you guys will get to decide the terms of that, of, who keeps what, how that'll be dealt with. If one person wants to keep the house, one person doesn't, might say that they have first right to buy it, whereas you don't really have that opportunity in, if you go down the court track, unless you enter into consent orders. But even then, a court still has to consider that those orders are just and equitable, whereas a financial agreement, the court doesn't essentially see it at first. It's just your legal representatives and yourselves. And I guess that's where it saves you the time from going into court. And once it's signed, it's, if everything's enforceable and everything's correct in the agreement, it is binding. But unfortunately, I guess with like any kind of court order or agreement, there's not really 100% certainty whether that will be set aside in future or not.
Yeah, but it is protecting you anyway, and it's giving you peace of mind. That's the way that I see it. It's peace of mind. And, if two people come together and they've decided to go into business and they've built this business together, a conversation around, okay, well, if this was to happen, in the worst case scenario, if this was to happen, what would happen then? But you're in a great place because you're still in love, you're still happy, then you're able to have a really great agreement. But it also allows the couple at that point in time, when they're having that difficult conversation, to feel all the emotions that they need to feel. That's, I can't explain that until you actually go through the process. But you actually feel all the emotion, you feel the fear. And then you're able to come to an agreement because you're able to actually breathe, because you're not actually going through that process.
No.
So you're able to be more rational versus when you're in that actual process and you're in the worst case scenario and your emotions are all over the shop, because you're also grieving a relationship at that point in time.
Yes.
And people don't get that. You have to grieve a relationship.
And it might be that first conversation is really hard because, a lot of people freak out, or they don't understand what it means, but it gives you the time to, discuss it. And I guess that way, if they acquire something in their own name in the future as well, you can ensure to them, well, that's yours then, or, things like that. I guess as well, I think it's probably a harder conversation for younger couples, who are, both starting. I think then again, it really just depends. But I think for, most people will understand if you've already had, your own assets, businesses, they'll probably understand that that is something that is important to you and that you would want to keep that. And I guess if they're understanding of that, they won't really have an issue with entering into an agreement. But a lot of times people still do sometimes freak out because they just don't know. But
you know what it is? It's, oh my God, you don't trust me.
Yeah.
It's not about trust. It's, I don't want to go through the emotional crap ever again. Or if something was to happen, I just want this to be clean.
Yeah. I guess then being in a, more amicable place and a healthy mindset, it's easier to sit down and say, okay, well, if we separate, this and this will happen. Rather than when you actually separate and everyone hates everyone and, there's lots of emotions and, oh no, she's not getting the you know, the kettle or something, and people start fighting over such silly little things, you know, because they're just so driven by emotion.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, like people fight over couches and things like that, and it's like, why are you wasting time and money over a couch that you could, you know, just replace and save yourself the legal fees and the stress? But I guess with property and that, everything you have gets thrown in the pool at the end of the day when you separate. And I guess depending on how long your relationship is, you know, if it's a relationship of 30 years, you know, your argument of, oh, well, I brought that in isn't really as sufficient anymore because, you know, you've built a whole life over 30 years, probably had kids, things like that. So that doesn't really matter as much anymore. Yeah,
well, it takes the stress away. Like, that's the definite. And then, honestly, it's an investment into both of your futures. But it's also something that hopefully you basically will put in the bottom drawer and never have to use because you've prepared for the absolute worst. And when money's taken out of the equation, it's like your relationship just flows.
Yeah, I actually agree. I think that it does seem to help a lot of people, you know, with the ease of mind of what happens and, you know, rather than, if we separate. I guess another thing would be, you can include things such as spousal maintenance, which is a type of ongoing financial support if you separate. You know, agreements can also cover that. You know, for example, if one person does eventually have children or things like that, it can help, you know, different scenarios, but those ones are probably a bit harder to draft because you're trying to essentially predict the future of what's going to happen.
Yeah, right. It's a very taboo subject when it comes to relationships, but I'm so glad that you were on the show today and we were able to discuss it. So what I'll do is I'll put all of your details in the caption, and anybody who wants to go down the road of having those difficult conversations, which I highly recommend that you do, I will get them to reach out to you and they can have a conversation with you as well.
Yep, anytime.
Thank you. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.